Once upon a time, there was a man who went around selling small rat traps of wire. He made them himself at odd moments from the materials he got by begging in stores and at big farms. But even so, the business was not profitable, so he had to resort to both begging and petty thievery to keep his body and soul together. Even so, his clothes were in rags, his cheeks were sunken, and hunger gleamed in his eyes. No one can imagine how sad and monotonous life can appear to such a vagabond, who plods along the road, left to his own meditations. But one day this man had fallen into a line of thought which really seemed entertaining to him. He had naturally been thinking of his rat traps, when suddenly he was struck by the idea that the whole world about him, the whole world with its land and seas, its cities and villages, was nothing but a big rat trap. It had never existed for any other purpose than to set baits. It offered riches and joy, shelter and food, heat and clothing, exactly as a rat trap offered cheese and pork, and as soon as anyone let himself be tempted to touch the bait, it closed in on him, and everything came to an end. The world, of course, had never been very kind to him, so it gave him unwonted joy to think ill of it in this way. It became a cherished pastime of his to think of people he knew who had let themselves be caught in the dangerous snare, and of others who were still circling around the bait. One dark evening, as he was strolling along the road, he caught the sight of a little grey cottage by the roadside, and knocked on the door to ask shelter for the night. Nor was he refused. Instead of the soft faces which ordinarily met him, the owner, who was an old man without a wife or a child, was happy to get someone to talk to in his loneliness. Immediately he put the porridge pot on the fire and gave him supper. Then he carved off such a big slice from his tobacco roll that it was enough for both the stranger's pipe and his own. Finally he got out an old pack of cards and played mulus with his guest until bedtime. The old man was just as generous with his confidences as with his porridge and tobacco. The guest was informed at once that in his days of prosperity his host had been a crofter at the Ramsau Iron Works and had worked on the land. Now that he was no longer able to do day labor, it was his cow which supported him. Yes, that Bossy was extraordinary. She could give milk for the creamery every day, and last month he'd received all of 30 kroner in payment. The stranger must have seemed incredulous, for the old man got up and went to the window, took down a leather pouch which hung on a nail in the very window frame, and picked out three wrinkled 10 kroner bills. These he held up before the eyes of his guest, nodding willingly, and then stuffed them back into the pouch. The next day both men got up in good season. The crofter was in a hurry to milk his cow, and the other man probably thought he should not stay in bed when the head of the house had gotten up. They left the cottage at the same time. The crofter locked the door, put the key in his pocket. The man with the rat trap said good bye and thank you, and thereupon each went his own way. But half an hour later the rat trap peddler stood again before the door. He did not try to get in, however; he only went up to the window, smashed a pane, stuck his hand, and got hold of the pouch with the 30 kroner. He took the money, thrust it into his own pocket, and then he hung the leather pouch very carefully back in its place and went away. As he walked along with the money in his pocket, he felt quite pleased with his smartness. He realized of course that at first he dare not continue on the public highway, but must turn off-road into the woods. During the first hours this caused him no difficulty. Later in the day it became worse, for it was a big, confusing forest which he had gotten into. He tried, to be sure, to walk in a definite direction, but the path twisted back and forth so strangely. He walked and walked without coming to the end of the wood, and finally realized that he had only been walking around in the same part of the wood. All at once he recalled his own thoughts about the world and the rat trap. Now his own turn had come. He had let himself be fooled by a bait and had been caught. The whole forest, with its trunks and branches, its thickets and fallen logs, closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison from which he could never escape. It was late in December. Darkness was already descending over the forest. This increased the danger, and increased also his gloom and despair. Finally he saw no way out. He had sunk down on the ground, tired to death. But just as he laid his head on the ground he heard a sound, a hard, regular thumping. There was no doubt as to what that was. He raised himself. Those are the hammer strokes from an iron mill, he thought. There must be people nearby. He summoned all his strength, got up, and staggered in the direction of the sound. During one of the dark evenings just before Christmas, the master smith and his helper sat in the dark forge near the furnace waiting for the pig iron, which had been put in the fire to be ready to put on the anvil. All the time there were many sounds to be heard in the forge. The big bellows groaned, and the burning coal cracked. Outside roared the waterfall, and a sharp north wind whipped the rain against the brick-tiled roof. It was probably on account of all this noise that the blacksmith did not notice that a man had opened the gate and entered the forge until he stood close up to the furnace. Surely it was nothing unusual for poor vagabonds without any better shelter for the night to be attracted to the forge by the glow of the light which escaped through the sooty panes and to come in to warm themselves in front of the fire. The blacksmith glanced only casually and indifferently at the intruder. He asked permission to stay, and the master blacksmith nodded a haughty consent without honoring him with a single word. The tramp did not say anything either. He had not come there to talk, but to only warm himself and sleep. In those days the Ramsau iron mill was owned by a very prominent ironmaster, whose greatest ambition was to ship out good iron to the market. He watched both night and day to see that the work was done as well as possible, and at this very moment he had come into the forge on one of his nightly rounds of inspection. Naturally the first thing he saw was the tall ragamuffin. The ironmaster did not follow the example of the blacksmith, who had hardly deigned to look at the stranger. He walked close up to him, looked at him very carefully, then tore off his slouch hat to get a better view of his face. "Oh, but of course it's you, Nils Olaf. How you do look!" The man with the rat traps had never before seen the ironmaster at Ramsau, and did not even know what his name was. But it occurred to him that if the fine gentleman thought he was an old acquaintance, he might perhaps throw him a couple of kroner. Therefore he did not want to undeceive him all at once. "Yes, God knows things have gone downhill with me. You should not have resigned from the regiment. That was the mistake. If only I had still been in service at the time, it would have never happened. Well, now, of course, you will come home with me."